of conceptualizing the neural basis of words and syllables. And of course, there must be some internal structure. We know, for example, that there are connections between the different areas in perisylvian cortex. For example, different auditory cortices and different inferior frontal areas, premotor, prefrontal, and a primary motor cortex in the frontal lobe, and the auditory core, belt and parabelt are the relevant areas, which are connected roughly in a next neighbor-like fashion if we can apply the knowledge from macaca and some more recent information gained through DTI or connection mapping even in humans. Now we can turn this knowledge about cortical connectivity in a neuronal model and actually have it learn word representations in order to simulate what our predictions on cortical activations might be if we understand and if we produce words. And this is now the work by Max Garagnani. Here you see our model where the 6 critical perisylvian language areas are each modeled by a separate module, if you wish, by an array of neurons. They are connected with each other. There are topographical connections between any pair of layers. And what we do, we co-activate now motor and auditory cortex, specific sets of neurons on both sides, and we observe the formation of some of yeah. If I could have a pointer, I would not be unpleased. It doesn't seem to. Sorry? Yeah. It doesn't. Yeah. Good. Anyway, thanks. Now we can use such models to do many things. One of the many things is to make predictions on the cortical activation during processing of words and other patterns. What a model of this so what we did in one simulation now was we compared the activation produced in such a model when words and when matched meaningless items, unlearned, not learned items, pseudo words, were presented to such a model, thereby simulating the comprehension of meaningful words and meaningless pseudo words. And the activation dynamics now revealed by this network was this: we saw a stronger activation generally under certain conditions when words were presented compared with pseudo word activation, which implies thanks very much. Which actually, so we see here a stronger activation for the red curve with the words compared with the pseudo word activation, which is best explained by this additional activation of the lexical network in this case, which is absent in the pseudo word case. This prediction can now be tested in a neurophysiological experiment, and we ask whether there's indeed stronger activations for words than pseudo words. And we did that using a brain response called the mismatch negativity. And to make a long story short, we found consistently in a long series of experiments stronger activation in mismatch negativity experiments to words compared with matched meaningless pseudo words. And interestingly, this was even so when we exactly matched for the phonetic and phonological properties of the critical stimulus. Here we presented the same syllable in the context of words or in the context of pseudo words, and this same stimulus produced a stronger brain response when it was in a meaningful context compared to a meaningless pseudo word context. And this is obviously in good agreement with the prediction of the model. Good. Now the model makes more predictions actually. If you look at it in more detail, there are the model has at least two parts. There's a superior temporal part where some neurons are situated, and an inferior frontal part too. Now, when we listen to words, there might be activation here in the back, which then spreads to the front, which takes a little time, dependent, of course, on the conduction velocities of the neurons. And we may now ask, indeed, whether we have evidence from the brain that there are two activations, a superior temporal and an inferior frontal one, and also especially for the fact for the prediction that one occurs before the other. Here in the inset, again, the prediction from Max Garagnani's model. There should be weaker but slightly delayed activation in the front. We looked at that now using magnetoencephalography, MEG, and we actually performed a kind of source localization on the MEG on the output of the 306 channels of our MEG system, and did a mathematical procedure called minimum norm current estimation in order to see the cortical activation spreading in cortex after the word could be comprehended. And what you see here is now a film which actually shows exactly this activation spreading. And if I show this again, there's activation first in superior temporal cortex, and then, as predicted, a quick blob in inferior frontal cortex. If we do statistics on that, we see that there's a significant delay, slightly delayed activation in inferior frontal cortex, and certainly two separate discrete sources. And here we have displayed side by side the model which we actually created and published in 1990 for the first time on the left, and on the right the recording and the empirical results. We could only get access to in the 2000s, simply because the machines had only been developed 10 years later. Right. Now, we may generally say that there's in language there are action perception networks, and they play a main role in speech perception. I'm now just repeating things Luciano has been elaborating on. Art Glenberg has been talking about in great detail before. I try to be quick, therefore. One important, so we have already also from neuroimaging quite a lot of evidence for that inferior frontal and premotor motor cortex activates when speech is being heard, indicating that the motor system plays a role, perhaps, or is at least involved in the process of speech comprehension, speech analysis. Well, one could still discuss whether this activation is critical for speech comprehension, but it may in fact reflect important auditory information in speech processing. But unfortunately, previous research, including our own, had not specifically addressed this prediction. So we asked, is the frontal and or motor activation specific, for example, to speech sounds? Might it actually reflect phonetic distinctive features, specific speech gestures? This now addresses an issue that came up yesterday. And we did an experiment now following the following prediction. We know that there's somatotopy in the motor system. This is one of the main features of the motor cortex. Motor and premotor cortex are somatotopically organized. We know that the hand and the leg are relatively high up in the motor strip, and the lips and especially the tongue are quite low in the motor system. And now, if we think of the speech sounds we articulate day by day, they are done to different degrees with different articulators. P, for example, involves the lips much more than other articulators, and T would overproportionally involve the tongue tip. So taking seriously the somatotopy of the motor system, we would predict different a different activation along the motor strip when we produce a P and when we produce a T, but perhaps if there are motor links in the perception, if the perceptual networks link up with the motor networks in speech perception also, then we would actually expect that such differential activation in the motor cortex would also, or premotor cortex and precentral cortex, would actually be visible even if we only hear syllables including P's and T's. And this is and the latter is what we actually found in a study published last year in the proceedings of the National Academy. And here, for example, activation for a movement localizer where our subjects just had to move their lips or tongue. We found differential activation in the precentral cortex. We found very similar activation situation for the silent articulations of syllables including P and T. And we saw a differential activation, significant differential activation in these regions of interest defined according to the motor localizers, also in a speech perception condition where our subjects just listened to syllables including P's and T's, which is consistent with the idea that language elements, and I now refer back also to the MEG work and to the earlier work on words. Luciano mentioned some of this important work, that language elements across the board, words, are even articulatory phonetic features. We may discuss in discussion whether articulatory gestures might be a different description here, whether those linguistic elements are organized, that these language elements are organized in the brain by action perception networks, by distributed cell assemblies in Hebb's sense.
Just a question. The stimuli you used in your NAS paper, they were pseudo words.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
Did you find an activation of Broca's region?
Yes.
During perception?
Yes.
In both cases?
Yes.
Okay.
Anyway, to show more pictures, but anyway, good. Now, let me shift to one more topic. The question about the representation of phonetic features of word forms, lexical elements, is an elementary one in linguistics. We may ask further questions, and it came up during this conference a few times, a little bit, the question about why don't you speak about meaning, why don't you speak about semantics? Well, I would like to compensate for that a little bit and present a little bit more data about possible mechanisms of meaning processing. Well, about 10 years ago, I wrote an article for BBS, for the Behavioral and Brain Sciences, discussing this issue already in great depth, and there were quite a lot of responses to this mostly favorable responses, to my great surprise, to this article, which actually explained meaning mechanisms tentatively in terms of distributed neuronal circuits. However, most of the commentators made a comment in the direction, well, we have now, the author makes a nice proposal, however, we have just now done an important work, which finished important work, which now finally clarify the question where meaning is situated in the brain, at which locus does meaning sit in the brain. And the answer to this meaning, this where question of meaning, was answered by these researchers in the following way, which led me to produce this diagram in the response to their contributions. And as you can see, there was a great variety of opinions expressed as to where the cortical meaning area should be located. And you may now say that this article is already almost 10 years old. Haven't things clarified meanwhile? No, they haven't. If you look at more recent review papers, you see quite a lot of variation still in the opinions about where meaning sits in the brain. Now, how can that be? Well, a possible explanation is based is in the tradition of Cognitive neuropsychology work by Warrington, Shellis, McCarthy had emphasized already in the 70s, 80s that possibly different conceptual and semantic categories may involve specific cortical areas to different degrees. And this was then still mostly based on lesion evidence, and meanwhile there are neuroimaging results as well speaking to this issue. So it may be that this question, where does meaning sit in the brain, doesn't actually make so much sense, but we have to ask what type of meaning are we actually talking about. Let me just explain this with a simple example. This overlaps partly with what Art already mentioned. Think of a word that relates to an object in the world, and the child may see it frequently in temporal vicinity to the occurrence of the word. In this case, the word would be heard, leading to some activation in perisylvian cortex, and the object, the relevant object, would be seen, so that there's activation in the visual system. So the co-activated neuron populations, based on correlation learning, would strengthen their connections, and therefore a higher order network, semantic network now, semantic/conceptual network might develop, which includes now the word form and a semantic part more in the back of the brain in this case. Now, this is not all words obviously refer to objects in the world. Others refer to actions, and in this case the situation might be slightly different, because as Art explained with very nice examples, the child may actually do the action while he or she hears the word being uttered by the adults. So in this case the situation is this: perisylvian activation for the hearing of the word form, and also some activation of the motor system, because the particular action is being carried out. So we come to the prediction that there's an entirely different type of network now for the action-related word, also with a perisylvian articulation-related lexical representation and a semantic representation, now drawing upon motor circuits outside the perisylvian language areas. And of course one may now say that obviously only a small percentage, only 20% of the words of a vocabulary are learned in contingency with objects and actions. There are later on learning steps where new words are related just to already learned words. So words occur together, and this is enough for extracting meaning. And in this case, we would of course assume that a perisylvian network without a semantic tail, so to speak, would be activated in close temporal vicinity with a network that has such semantic additions, therefore leading to incorporation and, as we said, parasitic semantic learning. So the newly learned word would extract some semantic feature neurons from the already learned lexical items. But to make a long story short, we would predict that there are different kinds of words, semantic kinds of words. Their brain correlates would have different distributions over the brain. There are visually related words here on the left, action-related words on the right, and we could see category differences. And there had been an outbreak of work in that direction in the mid-90s and late 90s. Here's one of our first studies we did on the difference between visually related nouns and action-related verbs. This was still done with EEG, and the diagram on the left and right both indicate that there are differential activation over the head, stronger activation to action-related words close to the action areas of the brain, and stronger activation to the visually related nouns over the back of the head, where the visual cortex is situated. Now, you still may say we are speaking about nouns and verbs here, so we don't know whether the lexical difference, noun-verb, or the semantic difference, visually action-related, would be relevant, but we did a follow-up on that. Now, this was published in 99. where we compared now the action verbs to the visually related nouns, but also different types of nouns related respectively either to actions or to visually perceivable objects, and we saw very similar dissociations and no difference, actually no significant difference between action verbs and action nouns. So from these data sets, we concluded and suggested that for these differences, these neurophysiological differences over the head recorded in the EEG, MEG, meanwhile MRI, we see primarily semantic features of words. Good. I do not want to. I also want to have to mention that there has been a great number of studies. I just started to list a few here, and you can see in the mid-90s there was quite a number of them, and all of them confirming, most of them confirming that there are category-specific brain activations for animal or tool words, for nouns and verbs, for visually related or action-related words. Great agreement. However, a few colleagues, especially some in Cambridge, could not replicate those results, which the reason for that might be discussed later. The more problematic thing about these previous early category-specific neuroimaging results are the following. Some authors claimed that there are important confounds in the early studies, namely that words and concepts may differ in their frequency of use, in their imageability, and this may have not appropriately controlled in some of the early studies. And then there are also intrinsic features of different conceptual categories, semantic categories. For example, animals seem to be mutually much similar than tools. Tools seem to vary on a lot of scales. They have very different visual features. Now, animals look very similar. Typical animals all have noses, eyes, and 4 legs, and so on. And this feature correlation of the conceptual structure, also perceptual structure, might be a confound here. So, according to my view, the previous work on semantic categories, on category specificity, had another problem, namely, especially the neuroimaging work, namely that the a priori predictions on the specific loci where category-specific cortical activations for these categories, nouns, verb, animals, tools, were observed. Those predictions were not very precise. It was something like a prediction like somewhere in anterior temporal or superior middle temporal gyrus there should be more activation for this and that, and then it was in many cases a surprise to see that it's just here in the brain where this little activation dot appeared. So from this perspective, it might be desirable to have precise predictions on where exactly category-specific semantic activation will occur, and if one could do that, if one could make an a priori prediction where the semantic activation should occur, one would have, and could verify that, one would have stronger support for a semantic category specificity. And this brings me to the issue of the action system and its connection to language mechanism, and also this had been covered already a little bit by the comment by Professor Morrow. And but let me just present the basic thing, the basic feature that the action and the language systems in the brain are heavily connected through short distance connections, next neighbor connections between Broca and other motor areas, and long distance connections also. Now we know about the motor system, of course, that it's somatotopically organized, and that the leg is at the top, the arm is localized laterally, and the mouth and face are in an inferior motor cortex and premotor cortex also. So from that perspective, correlation theory of lexicosemantic processing predicts that the semantic parts of the cell assemblies that process words that refer to actions done with different parts of the body, that those networks, those word webs, would actually differ in their cortical distribution. A leg word might have its semantic part close to the leg areas of the motor map in motor and premotor cortex, and an arm word would have these semantic neurons in dorsolateral cortex and in inferior frontal cortex. They would be situated for face-related words, so that the triplet of words kick, pick, and lick would actually produce in cortex very different activations. We tested that. We did that. We did an experiment on that with MRI with now this was first done with single words, exactly evaluated for their semantic features. It was made clear by this by the semantic ratings that we really had good face-related or arm-related or leg-related words respectively, and those were then presented to our subjects for reading in a passive reading task. And on the other hand, we also performed motor localizer tasks where we had our subjects move the finger, move the tongue, or move the foot. And this was this is from a paper we published three years ago actually. On the left you see here this somatotopic map with the foot, the finger, and the tongue movements. So these were this is the activation seen for the actions. And here on the right, you see the activation map for the passive reading of single action words, and it is very clear that, for example, the leg words activate at the top in the region of interest, strongly overlapping with this region of interest defined on the basis of the actual movements of the actual actions. And so on. So a similar situation was present for the arm words, and so on. So from here we have it seems that action words activate motor, premotor areas differentially. We have somatotopy. This was also shown then for sentences, as in Parma and Milano. And meanwhile, there are more studies confirming these results. But still, all this has been done with MRI. And if you think now, an MRI is a rather slow technique, so it takes a while for the brain response to follow the fast neuronal activation, the fast neurophysiological changes. And if you think of an experiment where you have to read words such as walk, look here at the screen, one may ask whether the conclusion about semantic activation in this case is really conclusive. Couldn't we ask what is our subject actually doing while lying in the scanner, looking at these words and waiting for 3 seconds or so until the next one comes up? And no surprise, some colleagues have then made a claim that what we are actually measuring is actually not semantic activation, but actually an EP phenomenon related to mental images being retrieved after the language had already been comprehended. And the competing view might be formulated in this way. We are actually looking at motor activation that reflects access to motor schemata as part of word-related semantic knowledge implemented as motor circuits embedded within a word's cortical representation, so on and so forth. So here we would say, in one case it's semantics, it's understanding itself. In the other case, it's post-understanding, and this reminded us of a term coined by Glenberg and Kaschak in 2002 already. They speak about post-understanding translation, and the question is precisely now: are we looking at post-understanding translation is our brain activation an index of post-understanding translation, something after understanding, or is it understanding itself? Now, how could we find out? I would state that with MRI, there's no hope. What we need is to ask at least the following 3 questions. Is the motor activation to action words immediate? Is it automatic? And is it functionally relevant? And we can do this using a range of different tools. In order to get at the automaticity and the earliness, the time course, the precessed time course, we can use fast neuroimaging, for example, MEG, and we can use tasks that do not focus the subject's attention to the stimulus material. And for that we now have MEG in Cambridge, and much fun with it. But here the point is that MEG can follow the cortical time course of activation millisecond by millisecond, and we can decide whether our activation spreading to motor areas, if it shows up in the MEG, happens at half a second or so, or very late after the word actually comes up and can be understood, or whether it's an immediate process taking place within the first, say, 200 milliseconds. And what we saw now here in the schematized activation films is that this spreading of neural activation to motor areas happens quite quickly, within 100, 150, 200 milliseconds after a word stimulus information is sufficient for word identification. Here on the left we have words, the brain response elicited by words that actually refer to actions performed with the arm and face, and you see that this movement towards the motor strip here happens at 130 milliseconds. Now here on the right we have a word we have words that refer to leg movements, and here you see this activation coming up here at the top slightly later, but still around at around 170 milliseconds, which is still very early from this. And we found such activation now in a range of experiments, not only in experiments where we focus the attention of our subjects to the words, like lexical decision experiments, but also in experiments where we systematically distract our subjects from listening to words. We play them a video film, for example, and tell them these auditory stimuli are totally irrelevant, ignore them. And we see this activation. This is actually from an ignore experiment. So this seems to be automatic, at least to a large degree. So the time course of semantic information access, just in a nutshell, looks somewhat like this. Activation now moves to the top, and the delays here are realistic in terms of cortical conduction delays. Now, I should also mention that the top left inset says that there's also correlation between semantic ratings and local activation strength in the different regions of interest. So from here we can say that action word related differential activation happens at 150, 200 milliseconds after spoken. Also written words, I have skipped that, can be identified, and we have done a larger number of studies. Here are some examples to confirm this, and also to confirm this observation that this motor activation in language comprehension is early and does not require focusing of attention. Right, now the third critical question, whether this motor activation is actually critical for word processing itself, was addressed, for example, in a TMS study where we shot at the different supposedly semantic parts of our distributed networks at primary motor cortex, at primary motor cortex of the arm and of the leg. These were minimal TMS pulses, and as you can see here on the left of this diagram, there was differential and now speeding of lexical decisions on arm and leg related words when a very slight, a minimal subthreshold a TMS pulse was given to the arm or to the leg region of the left hemisphere, indicating that this motor activation doesn't just happen for nothing, but that activation from there feeds into the lexical processing networks. So from here we propose that motor system activation elicited by action words is immediate, automatic, and functionally relevant, and therefore we would propose this is evidence that semantics proper is reflected. Good. So the answer to the more general question, where word meaning is processed in the human brain, has now a flexible answer. For example, in the case of action words, we have different parts of the motor system that play a role in the semantic representation and processing of words, according to what we found here in our results. And generally, the idea is that of discrete, distributed neuronal networks, distributed but discrete symbol processes that bind together word form knowledge and semantic knowledge related to actions and to objects and to other perceptual features of the reference of words. Now, if I can just take another, what is that? I cannot read it. 1 minute. Okay. If I can still take 1 minute to get to a question which is actually quite difficult, a difficult one, but still I think there is something interesting to say here. Do we have to stop at a level where we speak about objects and actions as reference for words, or can we actually move on from action to abstraction in our theorizing about the brain mechanisms of language and concepts? And we realize that abstract words are very, very different in nature. They are the grammatical function words, which are, according to psychological rating studies, the most abstract words on the abstractness scale. And then those freedom and beauty, those words are probably still according to the abstractness ratings, still moderately abstract. And then there are words such as round or triangle, which are abstract to a degree also, but still have a visual or an action-related link. So where are they in the brain? And you may now expect a little locus somewhere where the abstract meaning sits, as many researchers expected an answer of this kind to the question, where is meaning in the brain? The idea was, here is it. Here is a little area, and we should find it. And I showed you how wide the variance is in the opinions of the researcher. Now, exactly the same happens if you look now at the state of the art in the investigation of abstractness. Now, which is the cortical area of abstract meaning processing? If we look at the most highly abstract words, the functional categories of a language, we see very strongly left lateralized brain responses, as we documented 12 years ago, meanwhile, possibly due to very strongly left lateralized perisylvian cortex sources only. And now, if we look at more recent fMRI data, the conclusion is that we get a rather colorful picture when looking at the different areas activated in abstractness experiments. For example, the already cited study by Binder showed activation in left superior prefrontal cortex. Then the London group showed perisylvian activation much inferior to that. The Cambridge group showed parahippocampal activation related to abstract meaning processing, and a group in Leipzig states that it's actually the right hemisphere that plays a particular important role in abstract concept and meaning processing. So there isn't really much agreement here. And what's the reason? Well, do we need an area for abstractness? And the answer is, well, what is a neuron? What are neurons? What are neural elements cut out to do? And it had been stated already more than 50 years ago, actually by McCulloch and Pitts, that neural elements, neurons, are actually abstraction devices, that they are actually best described in terms of logical functions, that a neuron, depending on its threshold of activation and on its connectivity to other neurons, can be described as being synonymous with an or, an and, a not, and an either-or function. So the neuron as itself, everywhere in the cortex, is an abstract processor. So, but how can we now approach our meaning, word meaning problem here with such abstract, for example, either-or processes? The answer here is quite simple. If we look at the motor system, the premotor cortex, the motor cortex, we have there, as we have shown, body part-related action control neurons that may play a role in semantic networks. Now, if we have an abstract word such as, well, such as free, to free as an action word, this can obviously be done by moving the mouth. The judge who says that this person has to be free and thereby makes him free by opening the door in this way or in that way. So there's a large variance of individual movement, and a good way, a possible way to implement that in the brain is by an either-or neuron that sits close to these motor program neurons, and those logical operators would obviously sit very close to the action program neurons they operate on. And the very same point can be made for the visual system as well, only so anterior to the object, the neurons that process object features and object identity. There could be neurons that actually calculate either or conjunction functions over different representations. So we would actually get to arrive at a model of category-specific abstract processing of concepts and word meaning in left frontal and or temporal cortex, which makes a prediction on empirically also. I just want to mention that we have addressed this in a paper which came out last year in cerebral cortex, where we, for example, showed that form information for words like triangle or square activated dorsolateral prefrontal cortex just adjacent and anterior to where we found this somatotopic action word activation. Well, let me come to the conclusion slide. Word meaning is grounded in action and perceptual information. Likewise are the respective brain processes. Sensory motor accounts can model a range of semantic features and schemata, even abstract concepts to some degree. However, the full range of abstract meaning processes also requires inborn mechanisms. We cannot just state that everything is embodied or derived from experience. We have to state that there is this cortical logical calculus, as McCulloch and Pitts called it, which enables us to extract abstract information. Well, I should now turn to thanking my co-author again, Max Garagnani, and also a range of colleagues in Cambridge, especially Olaf Haug and Juri Stürov, who significantly contributed to the work I have reviewed here. Thanks so much for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much. Are there some questions? Very brief one.
Friedman, did you actually, in the network model, simulate the mismatch negativity? And if not, how did you, what's the logic for comparing the mismatch negativity results to the model activations?
we haven't. We have a little project on simulating the mismatch negativity, but the data I showed here are are not specific to mismatch negativity. So they are. The paradigm was not an oddball paradigm. Well, Max, if you want to comment on that, but we have. We are working on the mismatch negativity, but right.
Yeah. So basically, the idea, in my view, is that what the mismatch negativity does is to bring out essentially the the brain response to words or to pseudo words, and essentially the cortical mechanism which are at work there are always at work there. So in our simulation, we don't simulate the actual sequence of mismatch negativity presentation. What we do simulate are the cortical mechanism which we believe are underlying the effects which the mismatch negativity paradigm brings out. I don't know if that.
Well, I would say that this usually depends on what you consider the mismatch negativity. It is I think meanwhile very well established that the mismatch negativity is a tool for visualizing the neurophysiological effects of the existence of memory traces. This logic it's a new stream in mismatch negativity research. Natanen's '97 Nature paper, where they stated that they have proven the existence of cortical memory traces for speech sounds. Was the first using that logic, and our later work then on syntactic rules and on lexical representations. Together, by the way, together with the inventors of the mismatch negativity in Helsinki, was a logical continuation of that in the language domain. So it is correct that the mismatch negativity reflects a range actually of cognitive functions. But if we keep constant this factor of attentional switching, then we can still see the memory trace activations. That's a question which baseline is being chosen.
May I?
Go on with the other presentation, and then we have.
No, may I ask my question, please?
Sorry.
Now, apart from the fact that, as I showed yesterday, we had very similar result on words of pseudo-word ERPs. So no mismatch negativity, simply the ERPs recorded over the Broca's area or over the motor cortex, and show that pseudo-words activate much less, or at least in our phonological priming, much less than words.
Very consistent, yeah.
No, I think it's important to pose a question at this point that has been posed to me many times, and I would like to know your opinion. So, if there is a lesion in the premotor cortex, patients usually they don't have big problems in understanding action words. While if some problems there are more related, according to the classical literature, are more related to the lesion of Broca's area. You know very well the story of the difference between nouns and action verbs. So, which is your opinion on this problem?
I have to show a slide.
Please do that.
Because it's wrong.
I'm very happy if it's wrong.
We have done in Cambridge. We have done a series of experiments on inferior frontal problems, and the result generally is that we see should actually do some weightlifting. The result generally is that if there's a unilateral lesion in only one hemisphere, then there might be a deficit which needs, in order to become visible, which needs psychological techniques such as a lexical decision task, constrained experimental procedures. But if there's a bilateral lesion primarily affecting the inferior motor cortex, especially in motor neuron disease, it is very well known, meanwhile, that there is a very specific deficit in action word and also general action concept processing. So, in a specific study now done even on the right hemispheric action circuits, I would like to remind you of this MRI picture here, where we see very specific activations, not only along the motor strip in the left hemisphere, but also on the right. And we may ask about the functional significance even of this right hemispheric activation. And for that reason, we looked at patients with little lesions now in the right hemisphere. This is inverted. At the top left, for example, there's a small lesion in motor premotor cortex and hand region. And we tested them with action-related verbs with nouns of different categories. And what we saw consistently is that if the lesion was in frontal cortex, including motor premotor cortex, then there was a very clear drop in performance on the action verbs in lexical decision task. And a control group had their lesions in temporal occipital cortex, and they dropped on the visually related nouns. So it's not correct that inferior frontal lesions do not produce any clinical symptoms. They may not if the lesion is in the right hemisphere, but if you even in the right hemisphere, if you use the right testing procedures, putting them a little under stress and requiring speeded lexical decision responses, for example, we were able to show them. There's old data from Karamazza and Micheli from the 60s, 70s, where they already claimed that verbs are specifically impaired after Broca's lesion, Broca's area lesion. This is probably, as we would see it today, mainly due to the action relationship of most verbs. So I think there needs to be some shift of thought. The data are there. Thanks. But a very important question.
Okay, thank you very much. So.